tonight's lecturer is James Cooper, who is an associate professor at the Stuckman School of Architecture at Penn State University up in Happy Valley. In fact, actually, James drove here today through torrential rains and has arrived on time and in one piece, and we're thankful for that. James received his Bachelor of Technology in Architecture from Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. And he received his Master of Architecture, Master of Architectural History, as well as his PhD in Architecture from the University of Virginia. And first master, I missed a Michigan in there too. The first master's is also a Michigan master's. This guy has got more degrees than you can possibly imagine. In addition to Penn State, he's taught at Syracuse, University of Notre Dame, and University of Virginia. What have I left out? Something else?
No.
Pretty much, okay. His research focuses on Michelangelo's architecture, especially the use of drawing and precedent in his design process. One of the unique things, I think, about Jamie Cooper that you'll find, I'll wait this computer up for a second, is that he draws like a prince. He is well-versed like a historian and thinks like an architect. And this is really a kind of unique combination. I don't know if you've spent much time around true PhD architectural historians. They spend a lot of time in archives. They spend a lot of time trying to find footnotes about this and that and the other thing. And oftentimes they can very much miss the point of what architecture is all about. Now, that's not true of art historians here in the School of Architecture, but in general this has happened in the past, where a historian, I recall a story that our friend Tom Schumacher used to tell about a historian at a certain West Coast school who put her hand up to ask Tom a question at the end of a presentation where Tom was talking about the role of tracing paper in the design process. And the question was, well, where did you see that article about tracing paper in the design process? Where can I find the footnote on that? And Tom's response was, it's part of studio culture. It's what you learn when you learn the craft, the nonverbal craft of architecture. And what I think is really important about what Jamie does, to put it in the familiar, is that Jamie is an incredibly talented draftsperson who interrogates architecture with drawings in much the same way that one could interrogate a text. Although he doesn't do this simply by interrogating with drawings, he interrogates text and drawings simultaneously and draws conclusions that can only be drawn from bringing both of those things together, which I think is very unique about how many architectural historians do that. Not many architectural historians are equipped to do that. Several years back, I won't say how many years back, yours truly turned 50 and was presented with a gift from among others, Michael Ambrose and other members of the faculty, as a sort of rite of passage into 50. And there was this huge print that's a version of the Pantheon that you see on the wall. And it was absolutely the best gift that I think I've ever received. It's somebody showing me an image of the Pantheon where it was planned, section, elevation, reflected ceiling, all at the same time, all kind of contorted around the major axes of the Pantheon. And I said, who drew this drawing? And I've had the luxury, I think, in the past several years, teaching with Michael in Rome, of meeting Jamie in various occasions, most recently over a great dinner at Costanza in Rome, where we learned about Jamie's continuing passion for the drawings of Michelangelo, which begat this lecture this evening, as well as his incredible passion, and you can get him in a sidebar at the end on this story, about pyroclastic eruptions. So if you really have a question about what happened in 79 AD to the people on site, he can tell you, and you should imagine the story as you are digging in with one of those marrow spoons into a piece of ossobuco to extract the bone marrow, listening to his story about what happens to people in the midst of a plebeian eruption of Vesuvius. Jamie, glad to have you here this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Nice introduction. Indeed, I did go a little overboard with my colorful description of what happened to the poor souls in Herculaneum in the evening of 79 AD in the presence of Michael and his wife and his mother-in-law and his baby and everybody. And suddenly, in the middle of dinner, I suddenly realized this probably isn't the best topic of conversation because it's pretty gory. That movie missed it all. You know, that movie a couple years ago was terrible. It was terrible. Right, I've got 2 books on the go right now. This is one of them, and it is almost ready to go. I'm trying to find a new publisher for it. I actually had a publisher. We had a huge falling out because it never occurred to them that I might want to have full-page images in a drawing book. So I kind of forced them into a divorce. So this is a 350-page book that hopefully will be in print fairly soon, and this is sort of the amateur version of it that Marissa actually had as an older version in her first-year drawing class at Penn State. All right, so that's the intro. Image, now to PowerPoint. So I asked Brian what he wanted to hear about today, and I gave him a choice between the Laurentian Library in Florence and Michelangelo at San Lorenzo, or the Campidoglio in Rome, both of which were subjects of big articles that I wrote in recent years. One was for JS, Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians in 2008 on the Campidoglio, and the other one was for the British equivalent of that, Architectural History, on the Laurentian Library in 2012. So those are going to be 2 chapters in this big book that I'm writing on Michelangelo for Yale University Press that is in progress. I was literally working on it this morning before I drove down here, and slipped a couple of images in here at the last minute to show you what's hot off the press. Actually, it's not hot off the press because it hasn't gone to press yet, so you have to take a vow of silence when I show you this recent stuff, because it's literally like 2 weeks ago. I was like, I had a eureka moment. So, yeah, now, you know, everybody knows that Michelangelo could draw very well. Everybody knows that Michelangelo could sculpt really well. Anatomical drawings that are breathtaking, perhaps only matched by Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. Absolutely stunning sculptures. How many of you have been on the Rome program here? Oh, good. So you're going to recognize a lot of the places that I show you. Did you all go to the Academia in Florence, or did you just see fake Dave in the Piazza della Signoria? Probably fake Dave. And, of course, the Sistine Chapel. And I've been in there, I don't know, 20 times now, and I still go in, even with thousands of people, you know, crammed in there like sardines. And I still come out with a neck ache and my jaw open because I'm just so much in awe of this masterpiece. It's kind of unbelievable that one human being could have accomplished all of this in a lifetime, albeit a very long lifetime. He died at the age of 89. So, he also did beautiful architectural drawings, not just beautiful architecture. And here, these are actually some very, very late drawings. So he was losing his eyesight when he did these. He'd be in his mid-80s when he's doing these. And what's remarkable about them is that even at that age, he is so, he's got so much energy, and he is so creatively motivated. And the creative process is still so fresh and so energetic in his mind that he superimposes idea upon idea upon idea so quickly that his hand literally can't keep up with his mind. And as soon as he started to draw something, he inevitably begins to realize how it could be further developed, and he stops drawing. And he moves on to another drawing, sometimes superimposed. And at a certain point, the drawing simply can't sustain anymore. And so he moves to another drawing and starts afresh, and the process starts all over again. Now, it's kind of remarkable that he had started his architectural career when he was in his early 40s at San Lorenzo. But the fact that he died at 89 means that he had a good 50 years of architectural career. Now, he did Oops, that's in the wrong order. Sorry. Hang on. Let me just, this is the slide that I just put in, so I animated it wrong, so hang on 1 second. Let's see. Oh, sorry. Just gotta put that back. Oh, no, there's some that back too. It's probably not going to work. Well, maybe it's a good thing because I was almost afraid to show it to you because it is still so hot off the press. Okay. Well, he did drawings that were as complex as this. This drawing, I've seen a lot of these drawings in person. It's about this big. It's probably the largest architectural drawing that he ever did. And interestingly, it's a very early proposal for the San Lorenzo facade, which of course was never built. And he used a method of design where he would start with the proverbial, what we might call the proverbial napkin sketch, like in a restaurant. And the design process would continue all the way up into doing presentation drawings. And a lot of you studio students will understand that in the process of doing a drawing that was intended to be purely representational, to show to the Pope, he suddenly had another idea. And that's why this drawing is not finished. It's very unlikely that the Pope and his brother, the Cardinal de' Medici, actually saw this drawing. It's more likely that he got to a certain point, glanced at some precedents, which happened to be drawings by his good friend Giuliano da Sangallo the Elder, who died just before this project got started, and using that as a source of inspiration, did another drawing that, I hope I got these in the right order here. There it is. You're not supposed to be seeing that, the big thing yet. That's probably the next drawing, or one of the next drawings after that great big one. He completely scrapped the scheme, and this drawing right here, which I just saw last fall, is about this big. So he went from a drawing this big to a drawing this big in that chronological order. So he was not married to ideas. He was very fluid in his creativity and his ideas all the way up until construction. And in many cases, he didn't actually complete any buildings himself. In fact, not one building was actually finished by Michelangelo. He could not bring the design process to an end. Even under construction, he was changing things. A modern-day equivalent that many of you might have as a hero is Carlos Scarpa. Scarpa spent a lot of time on site working with the contractors, great respect, their ideas going back and forth. And you can see it in his work. And in fact, I have to make the connection between Scarpa and Michelangelo. They actually used very much the same drawing process, sort of palimpsest of ideas. So that stage of development led to this stage, and we're talking just a couple of weeks later. And here you can actually see him setting up a hardline drawing that historians have always been slightly baffled by. Clearly, it's a partial section and elevation of the north end of the facade of San Lorenzo. In other words, looking at this elevation from that side. And he's just developed the idea of this, rather than being a skin attached to the front of the church like Alberti's facade for Santa Maria Novella, he's thinking about it as a three-dimensional entity. And what's baffled a lot of historians is exactly what this thing is. And I've always suspected that I knew what it was, and I bet a lot of you who have been to Florence might know this too, or might have the same suspicion. If you remember San Lorenzo, it's got all sorts of horizontal ribs on it that were intended for the facade that never got built to grab onto, presumably a facade perhaps designed by either Brunelleschi or Manetti, his successor. So what I think what Michelangelo is drawing here is in fact part of the profile of the facade of San Lorenzo. And his scale for the drawing is right there, 1 Florentine braccia, which is a forearm. Braccia is the unit of measure they used in the Renaissance in Florence. And this is where I think that maybe I've got a slightly different take on things than most art historians, because in order to study that drawing, what I did was I drew a bunch of drawings of San Lorenzo myself, because I could not find any half-decent measured drawings that were accurate. I would look at the drawings, I would compare it to other drawings, I would find contradictions, then I would look at my own photographs and my own drawings and realize that none of them were right. So it's like, oh well, I got to spend the next 2 months doing drawings of San Lorenzo. So I did this partial drawing of the north elevation of San Lorenzo, which shows the arcading in Pietraforte, marching along the north side, and here are those ribs that I just mentioned. And these are the steps going down to the piazza, and the famous straw market, which used to be in Piazza San Lorenzo, was along this side of the church, and it's now actually been moved out of the piazza. It's now all stuffed into Piazza Mercato Centrale, right next door. Partial plan, and something that's kind of interesting right there that I'm not going to get into, but is also a bit of a eureka moment. And then I superimposed Michelangelo's drawing using Photoshop onto this elevation. And, sorry, they're way out of order. If you take that drawing and look at it really, really closely, you begin to recognize that there are certain little, what look like tick marks, just little dashes. And after a while, you begin to recognize that these little dashes have got a certain rhythm to them. And lo and behold, what this is a measured drawing with a cross-section of the front of San Lorenzo, which is exactly 3 braccia wide, according to my own measure, and also according to Michelangelo's scale. He only drew it to here because he only needs that much of it as an anchor for this design development drawing, which he never intended for our eyes to see. And he starts measuring out from this anchor how far out this facade scheme wants to project. And this is where it's kind of bizarre. He's obviously got certain elements like the column and the entablature and the mezzanine and the upper story already fixed in his mind. And I think he's probably looking at a drawing that he's just done that might not be so accurate. And so now he's testing those ideas by drawing it to scale. Okay? And if you start to look closely at this, not only do you find the little tick marks, which you guys can't see from where you are, and I can't see even here, that all those little tick marks are linked by these little teeny freehand arches. And they aren't arches, they're just little arcs. And this is literally what he's doing, I've come to the conclusion. I was just writing this up. He's taking a wooden ruler, he's pressing it up against the drawing, he's measuring over, and you can find the braccia measurements that very clearly position this, because that's already in his mind set. Now he's trying to figure out how to develop the sandwiched part of the facade between his formal front facade and the roughed out facade at back. So this is the north elevation, that elevation, and he's searching for form by using measurement. He's taking a wooden ruler or something that's got braccia measured on it at that scale. He's pressing it against the paper. He's got his lead pencil, which is really made out of lead, and he's putting tick marks, but rather than doing a tick mark, he's doing a tick mark and then jumping to the next one. And you can actually hear him doing it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 braccia. And he looks at his drawing and he says to himself, no, that pilaster's not going to fit there, it's too compressed. Let's try it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, a mezzo braccia. And then he's looking at his drawing and he's visualizing in his mind's eye stuff that we don't see because he's never drawn it. So if you look at the under-drawing, if you look at all of the little marks drawn by him that indicate measurements, this is kind of like, I discovered this, and as soon as I started seeing these things, I couldn't stop seeing them. They're everywhere. Look at this. Okay, don't look. There we go. They're everywhere. And they're always a horizontal line. But there's never, this is what I would do. I would put my scale against the drawing, I would take my main line or whatever, draw a horizontal line, put my scale on the line, and then put tick marks from the scale, right? You guys all draw, you know what I'm talking about. Well, he's just skipping a step. He's, rather than drawing the line and then putting the scale onto the line, he's putting the scale right onto the drawing and just going, he's measuring over. But he's not drawing anything. He's only measuring. And what's interesting is that he stopped the drawing at this point because he realized, probably in the process of doing that, he had another epiphany and came up with an idea that led to the final scheme, which I'm not really going to talk about. But look at this. This is really interesting. When you put this drawing on San Lorenzo and you get it to the same scale as my drawing, you recognize that Brunelleschi's entablature right here, look at the correspondence. Brunelleschi's side aisle clerestory, look at the correspondence. The entablature of the clerestory, perfect. The lean-to roof of the side aisle, perfect. The clerestory of the nave, perfect. And the only thing that Michelangelo does not align is the upper cornice, because he's struggling with the proportion between that order up there and this order down here, and an unfortunately tall zone in between, because it was never really intended to receive the sort of classical facade that he intended, which is probably why Brunelleschi never designed it, because he didn't know what to do. So, I mean, this is a remarkable drawing because you can see all of these stages of the way he develops a design all in one shot. Now, here's the cool thing. Look at this. He's just simply adding a bay to the church. So the first thing that he draws after doing the cross-section, which you can see lines up with my drawing perfectly, is the center line for that column. And like I said, that was his starting point. And nobody has ever talked about Michelangelo being such a respectful contextualist. You know, he's always the divine master who kind of ignores context and does his own thing and doesn't take into account any precedents because he's an anti-classicist. Well, frankly, that's all BS. This is what I'm trying to show, is that it's not only, I'm not trying to knock him off of his perch. I think that showing you all of this stuff and me discovering all of this stuff actually makes it even that much more extraordinary. And the reason why we don't see many of these drawings is because he periodically had his assistants burn them. Because he didn't want us to know the labors that he went through in the creative process. One of Michelangelo's greatest masterpieces was Michelangelo. So, Laurentian Library, this is my own drawing of it. Again, I drew this for the sake of just doing a nice drawing, but in the process I learned an awful lot about the building that I hadn't noticed before. And this is it in line form, and here it is shaded. And so by doing my own drawings of his buildings and other people's buildings, such as Hadrian, I discover an awful lot. And the other thing that I do is I do drawings of Michelangelo's drawings. So I've seen about 30 or 40 originals in the Casa Buonarroti in Florence and the Ashmolean in Oxford, England. And I sat myself down, I brought out the originals. I practically needed a letter from the Pope to actually get access to them. Finally get access to them given the white cotton gloves. They lay out the folio in front of me, open it up, and there's the drawing that I've seen published in books 100 times, and I'm looking at the original. And you know, after you get over the sheer shock of it, you know, and you just can't believe it. It's like, well, what do I do now? I mean, there it is. Okay, what do I do now? And the woman who's sort of guarding me is kind of looking at me like, what's he doing over there? And so I thought, well, I draw, he draws, I'm going to do a drawing of his drawing. So I broke out my little pencil case and got out my dividers and my pencil and all of my stuff. And she gets really alarmed and comes running over to me and she says, "Que cosa fai? What are you doing?" And I was sort of really scared. And I said, well, I'm going to actually copy Mike's drawing into my sketchbook line by line. And maybe I'll learn the meaning of every single line. And indeed, it was a huge, huge help. And she said, oh, well, that's very original. I've been working here for 25 years, and nobody has ever done that before. And so this is pretty much my whole dissertation in this one sketchbook. So I'll let you all take a gander at it if you wish, as long as your fingers aren't dirty. Okay, so Laurentian Library. There's San Lorenzo in Florence. And the church was built in 1419. It wasn't completed until the 1490s, long after Brunelleschi died. The last thing to be built in the 15th century was the arcading, the veneer that I showed you on this side of the church. North is that way. This is the monastery. Fragments of the old monastery were kept where possible. Fragments of the old church, the Romanesque church of San Lorenzo, were kept. In fact, that's what dictated the module that Brunelleschi used for the church, is the Romanesque church. The crypt below the church is almost entirely Romanesque. There's an aerial view from the Campanile of the Duomo, and you can see the various parts of the San Lorenzo complex. There's Brunelleschi's church, the old sacristy by Brunelleschi, which is right there. The new sacristy by Michelangelo on the right there. As a pendant, symmetrical pendant, the old sacristy. And the cloister of the monastery, which may have been designed by Brunelleschi, but we know for sure it was built by a guy named Manetti. And the Laurentian library. That's the vestibule, and there's the reading room, and there's the site of a room that was never built that Michelangelo designed. Now, well, I've got that image there. How many of you are studio students, undergrads? Okay, if your professor gave you a studio project where you had to work in a historic context like this, and I want you to imagine, put that on pause for a second. Imagine for a moment that this does not exist, and that the roof simply goes up to a peak and back down the other side, just like that. In other words, the roof there, before Michelangelo built the Laurentian library, used to look like that. This story did not exist. Okay? The vestibule, which is right there, did not exist. So if your studio professor said to you, I want you all have to design a library for this monastic complex in Florence, and you have to put it on the roof of a building that was built in the 15th century. In other words, the width of your library is going to be fixed, the length of your library is going to be fixed, you're going to have to design a staircase to get from what was the top floor up to your new floor, and those are your restrictions, and you have to use, with a fair degree of flexibility, let's say the classical language of architecture. Most of my students at Penn State would hate me for that, because it would limit their creative freedom. It would be shackles. Well, the truth is, every single one of Michelangelo's projects, he had to design with an incredibly limiting and restrictive site conditions. And the fact of the matter is that the brilliance of his solutions were inspired by those restrictive conditions. Problems like that, the sheer act of problem solving was one of Michelangelo's most important sources of inspiration. So problem solving, purely technical and functional problems, inspired very creative solutions. And sometimes it would be forced upon him, and then he would realize what he's got and he would run with it. And so there's a good lesson there in terms of respecting site conditions, and because those will often inspire the greatest solutions. My favorite Carlo Scarpa drawings are the Castelvecchio in Verona and the Cuore di Stampali in Venice, both of which are built on very, very historic existing buildings. There's one or two houses that Scarpa designed from the ground up, carte blanche, and really they're not very good. His work is much better when he's got restrictive conditions. So, here's the facade, very quickly. I'll just jump through this. These are the drawings by Giuliano da Sangallo that inspired Michelangelo. There's the way the facade looks today. This is this giant model in the Casa Buonarroti in Florence, which is Michelangelo's last name was Buonarroti, if any of you didn't know. And there's that drawing I showed you a few minutes ago in black and white there on the right. This is important because there's a thread of continuity through all of Michelangelo's architecture that you have to recognize in order to understand any building in isolation. You can't look at them in isolation. And that's another problem that we have with historians, is that very often they look at buildings as if they're sort of paperweights you can hold in your hand, irrelevant of context. So here's this big section that I drew of San Lorenzo in order, again, to study Michelangelo's drawings. And so I think I could say that this is the most accurate drawing out there. Well, it's not out there yet, but will be out there because it's the product of a lot of research into other drawings, plus my own measurements, at least as high up as I could reach. And then using kind of my own version of photogrammetry to figure out elevations and heights and stuff. And there's the facade as it is. So there's the section. There's the facade that was never built. Back to the section. There's a partial plan of the front of the roughed out church. There's the model of the Casa Buonarroti. And if you look closely at this, you can see that Michelangelo is being very, very respectful once again. Look at the alignment of this axis, the side chapels, that axis, that axis, that axis, and this axis. He takes this dimension right here, and he repeats it right here and right here. And because Brunelleschi was such a sort of Mies van der Rohe of his day in terms of being very modular, what he ended up with was A, B, B prime, A, B, A. A very nice rhythm. And that rhythm would appear in almost all of his subsequent projects. Sadly, this was never built. That's what it would have looked like. And I've got a lot more to say about that, which I will hold off on for now. But one really interesting thing is that, again, whoops, in terms of context, Michelangelo had different conditions in the piazza than he does today. How many of you have been in Piazza San Lorenzo? Okay, if you were to imagine that facade in the piazza, as the piazza exists right now, let's say you're walking at Via Borgo San Lorenzo, you turn into the piazza and you see this huge facade in white marble. It would be overwhelming. The piazza's not big enough for it. It's too dominant. And most historians actually think that the facade, that this would have been considerably larger than what I'm suggesting here. But even if it were, according to the way I've scaled it, it would be really dominating. But watch this map come and go really quickly here. Again, sorry, I've got a PowerPoint issue. And you'll notice an arrow. Right there, see the arrow? Sorry. See the arrow? There used to be a street entering the piazza right there that was right on axis with the church. And what it means is that you could have stood back about 400 meters from Piazza San Lorenzo and looked up this relatively narrow street, lined probably with Pietroforte and brick buildings, stuccoed brick buildings. And you'd see this gleaming white Carrara marble facade, blasted with light in the early morning hours because the facade faces east, unusually. And so it's not possible that somebody who is designing a facade with that much respect for Brunelleschi and the fabric of the old church, that he would not also be thinking about the larger urban context. Okay? And the fact is that in all of Michelangelo's subsequent projects, one can identify sequences of spaces and elements that are strung out along view corridors. Deep spatial views and compression and expansion. So I've also made some really cool discoveries about where the facade would have been positioned, and I think that I've discovered that Michelangelo actually built foundations for this facade, but nobody has understood what they are. They were dug up in 1912, and it was thought that these ruins in front of the church were actually ancient Roman shops. Well, if you look closely, you can see that there's a rather miraculous correspondence between these ancient Roman shops and Brunelleschi's church and Michelangelo's facade. That's quite a coincidence. Those are Michelangelo's foundations under there. That's kind of hot off the press. Okay, new sacristy. This came after San Lorenzo facade was canceled. It's modeled on the old sacristy. There's Michelangelo's, there's Brunelleschi's. Again, my own drawings. I'm not satisfied using drawings of others because usually they're wrong. So Brunelleschi, Michelangelo, fundamental difference. Michelangelo's is taller, and Michelangelo takes this language and wraps it around all four sides of the space. And because this is a funerary chapel, as is this, but Michelangelo's got 4 dead Medici to work with. Brunelleschi only had 1. So Michelangelo needs 4 tombs, 1 single tomb, 1 single tomb, and the most important double tomb. And the most important double tomb was never built. A few sculptures were done for it. Some beautiful drawings were done by him for that. I'll show you in a moment. And you can see that the fundamental difference between these two is the extra story in terms of the architectural space. And And that's purely for reasons of light. There used to be buildings, and in fact my drawing's wrong, I have to modify it. There used to be a house right here, literally coming up to the church like that belonged to a family called Nelli, N-E-L-L-I, a lower sort of nobility family of Florence, and they would not sell all of their property. And so Michelangelo, in order to get light into the chapel, had to jack it up another floor. That's the only reason. That's the only way he could get light into the chapel. He couldn't get light in from this side because of the transept of the church. He couldn't get light in from there because of that existing chapel. He could get light in from the north side, but the Nelli houses actually went like this, and there used to be a street running like that. And I don't know if any of you have noticed that this corner of the chapel is slightly chamfered. And it's because the trajectory, if you look at the trajectory of the chamfer, the cut corner, it follows exactly the trajectory of the street that used to be there and the angle of the Nelli houses. So Michelangelo has to raise the chapel up a story to bring in light. It's very important for the Laurentian library too. So there's the new sacristy. There's the actual space. There's the one of the ducal tombs. There's the other ducal tomb. Here's the altar, right there. This is the tomb that was never built. And when you walk in there, if you walk in there with a keen architectural eye, you might notice that there's a rather unfortunate jump in scale from the architecture of the tombs to the architecture of the chapel. You can even see it in this image. However, it's not finished. It was never finished. If we look at it more closely, there are the two ducal tombs, Lorenzo and Giuliana de' Medici, night and day, dawn and dusk, contemplative, active life, all sorts of wonderful metaphorical meaning embedded within the sculptures and their architecture. Cycles of life, cycles of the days, seasons of the year, all metaphorically represented. And river gods that should have been positioned right here. There are missing sculptures. So the unfortunate impression that one gets looking at these now, that these beautiful sculptures are going to slide off of the sarcophagi, would have been balanced by the presence of two more sculptures there and there and there, which would have created a very powerful kind of semi-pyramidal composition, triangular composition. And it would have climaxed at the top with actually a relief sculpture in the lunette above the tomb. But they were never built. More metaphorical symbolism there, an egg and dart pattern becomes little death masks. It's a gloomy, depressing place, frankly. And that's what's so great about it, because it's a funerary chapel. And the fact that Michelangelo put the light source so high up makes it even more crypt-like when you're in there. You feel as though you're in a crypt. Now, there are the drawings for one of the ducal tombs that were built, the single dead Medici. Here's the more important one for Lorenzo the Magnificent and his brother, who was murdered in the Pazzi conspiracy. And if you look at this, you can see it's a double tomb. It's got Mary with Madonna and child positioned at its center, and that would have been positioned right there, which is that spot right there. And you can see this is slightly different than what was built, but not too far off. And if one assumes that this would have been built not too far off from what we see, and we put the whole chapel together, we begin to recognize that there is a jump in scale. I added this is my own little watercolor that puts that tomb in place. And even in this rough sketch, you can see that suddenly you begin to read that architecture, that architecture, that architecture, and that of the altar, quite independent of the chapel itself. And it's almost like tombs that have been placed into the voids of triumphal arches. And one can do a lot of spatial diagrams of what Michelangelo was intending. The dialogue between the sculptures actually creates that triangle. Overlapping phenomenal spaces in the center. And one can imagine, again, that there are chapels behind, or spaces behind the tombs, and that he has simply placed the tombs in there such that you clearly see a difference in scale. And one of his early conceptual sketches even suggests chapels that are not there. Okay, back to the Laurentian library. So how do you get somebody from the existing second story here up to there? The Pope said, Mike, you're only allowed to disrupt 1 or 2 monks' rooms, and that's it. No more. So Michelangelo had to figure out a way to get people from this story up to this story, and he only sacrificed actually 1 room right there in order to do so. And he chose that room because the big, thick, heavy vaults and foundations of the original chapter house were sitting below it. And that could take the weight of Michelangelo's walls, which are still remarkably thin. So, the primary components, the vestibule with the famous staircase that gets you from point A to point B, and the long reading room, the juxtaposition of spaces. And if you think about this in terms of classical composition, tripartite classical composition, you've got, the pun is intended here, the introduction to the book, the body of the book, and at the far end of the reading room, the conclusion. But the conclusion was never built. Right there. And it was, you can see that there's a problem because there's a house right there, the Casa Martelli, which is still there, it's a museum, at that angle, relative to Michelangelo's reading room, which is a problem that he has an ingenious solution for. So here's an early drawing that Michelangelo did that I think is of that wall, right there. And I think that what this rectangle here represents is, you'll understand it in a minute, the blank space or the elevation between staircases that in this early iteration would have wrapped the walls. So that is that. And, you know, this is almost like a little diagram. This is, again, no bigger than your thumbnail, practically. It's so small. Stairs wrapping, turning, central landing, pop into the reading room. A lot of scholars don't recognize things like this that we, as architects, would recognize. That those rapid little lines right there are Michelangelo's shorthand for the stairs that are already there that get you from the lower level of the cloister up to the second level. And when you see them repeat, like right there, you immediately recognize that this is an aborted drawing that was going to be exactly the same thing. And you also recognize that this, too, is exactly the same thing. But what on earth is that all about? What's that circle doing there? There's the plan enlarged. Okay, now jump up to the elevation and you can see that it's composed basically of 2 drawings. One on the left at one scale and one on the right at another scale. I've reversed the chronology of how that was drawn. What Michelangelo is doing here, he started with this. And all he's drawing is the center bay of an A-B-A proposition. Narrow bay, wide bay, narrow bay. Which might be familiar to you because you just saw it in the Medici Chapel. He's referencing his own work, which referenced Brunelleschi's work. So he's just finished this space, or it's under construction a few hundred meters away. This space is almost exactly the same size. His first inclination is to actually quote himself. Now he would have been horrified to know that you're all looking at this, because it's not particularly inventive. In fact, it's kind of boring. It's kind of predictable. But Michelangelo probably knew that when he drew it, because he knew his own design process, and he knew that this was just this jumping off point for a design, an organic design process that would lead him, although he didn't know it at the time, to something truly extraordinary. But it's kind of interesting to see that, you know, in this day and age when we're all searching for sort of metaphors and far out there modes of ideation and looking to metaphors for sources of inspiration, that Michelangelo's sources of inspiration are actually Michelangelo and his illustrious predecessors. So what's he drawing there? He's drawing the center bay. You can see a giant pilaster and a giant pilaster. Then he starts to draw, because of the span, a double door sitting right here. This shows a single door, but one would expect the drawings to be different because he's developing ideas. Double door, and he starts to draw a relatively normal door frame around it. And then right there, he stops. Because something occurred to him right there. And what is that he drew right there? It's a Doric capital. And he went, Eureka, a smaller order. Let's work with that. So he starts the drawing again. This, from there to there, is simply this enlarged. The same sheet of paper. And you can see that it has gone from being a rather traditional door surround with a Doric capital superimposed to a giant pilaster, Doric column, Doric column, Doric column, giant pilaster. Now he's drawn the other A bay, but not this bay because that drawing's already in its spot. And so, a little bit of Photoshop trickery, and we can see it superimposed and what it would look like. Now, he puts that in his back pocket and he doesn't use it. Probably because he realized that at the time, the ceiling height of the vestibule was going to be the same height as the reading room. It wouldn't have popped up like it does today. And he would have recognized that he hasn't included an entablature up there yet. And he would realize that he would have a kind of a space that's of awkward proportions because this giant order is almost right at the ceiling level. It needs a bit of breathing room up there. So his next phase of development, there's a source of inspiration. His next phase of development, this shows actually what I was just talking about. Look at the height of the red line. That's the top of the giant order. Here's what was actually built. And the ceiling level originally was going to be at the height of that top red line. Like that. So if you look at that red line, I haven't yet included, he hasn't even gotten an entablature yet, and already he's at the ceiling level. That line right there. Back to that drawing. Zoom in on this strange thing. And you might already know where I'm going with this. You know what that is? It's a reflected ceiling plan. People say, oh, no, this is one of his earliest ideas for the steps. Because it's round. It's like, come on. No, it's not. It's a reflected ceiling plan. And what's this? That's the inner upper edge of a cove vault. Supposed to be a circle, but he's drawing really fast. Michelangelo is not necessarily a brilliant draftsman when he's doing a doodle. Nobody is. Nobody should try to be. So, next phase, he actually removes the giant order, but he leaves the minor order intact. Column, 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 column. And there they are. Column, paired columns, column, paired columns, and column that's not drawn. And he's thinking, well, I can't have these columns project out from the wall very far because I've got this weight issue. My walls have to bear down onto walls that are already there. I can't push my luck. So he's doing this sketch, which is kind of the interim sketch, and you can see the staircase is still wrapping the wall. He's starting to develop ideas for the staircase here with his reflected ceiling plan. See, it might not occur to you, but I mean, have any of you ever drawn a plan and then drawn a superimposed reflected ceiling plan on top of it? Or drawn the upper story of a building superimposed on the lower story so that you can see how they're going to connect? It's quite natural, right? That's what he's doing right there. So, look at those elements that he's drawn in his little plan detail. To keep the weight in line with the walls below, he's pushed those columns back into the wall surface. And then when you see a pair of them together, which he did not draw in his detail, there and there, he goes, wait a minute, I'm having deja vu. So he does this drawing. This is the next step in the development. This is my redrawing of it. And there's what was built. Look at the similarities. There's the floor level. There's the soffit level, which is the same level as the reading room floor. You can see that here he's already moved to a central stair, because why would he have a door right there if it was still hugging the wall, right? Jump ahead another step, and we see that there's a difference there. So what's going on? Michelangelo had this awesome idea. He had the idea of lighting the space because he had the same problem. He had the same problem that he had with the chapel. He's got the transept of the church on one side of this room, right there. He's got Brunelleschi's old sacristy right there. He's got his own reading room right there. How do you bring light into this space? How about through an oculus? Now, the Pantheon was on his brain because, I don't know if you noticed, that the chapel, the dome of the chapel is a literal quotation of the Pantheon in miniature, coffers and all. And on this sheet, look at what he draws right there. And there's a detail. Pilaster, column, column, pilaster. Well, look at this. Pilaster, column, column, pilaster. Sculpture niche, pilaster, column, column, pilaster, sculpture niche. Exactly the same thing. It's just been squished. And this is the sort of license that many other architects of the day would not have, let's say, enjoyed. So, look at the similarities between those two. That's my drawing, by the way, the Pantheon. That's the second of two. The one that Brian's got hanging on his wall, not the original, led to this one, and then that one led to a Mozart watercolor. Okay, so this is what this drawing represents. Very subtly, very lightly, he's drawn in the cove faults that I was just talking about. So, look at that, and then look at this. Cove vault is there and there in section. And if you look at his design for the triangular rare bookstore, which was never built, look at that little detail right there. Itty bitty little plan that shows exactly the same thing. Lighting it from above, because he had the same problem. Buildings on all three sides in that case. Now here's my reconstruction of what this scheme might have looked like. And you'll notice that there is a significant difference. What happens, you guys who have been to Rome should know this, what happens when you take a classical column and you increase it in height? What also increases? Even in Michelangelo's case, the diameter increases too. So he couldn't make the room any bigger. Okay, and then there are these two letters. This is where the text comes in. This is a letter from the Pope's agent in Rome, Michelangelo's friend Fatucci. His Holiness is very pleased to learn from your letter that you are preparing to make the vestibule as requested. Now, as to the window over the roof with the glass lights in the ceiling, His Holiness says that it seems to him very fine and novel. There's nothing preventing you from doing it, but he says that you'll have to hire 2 friars who will do nothing but clean up the pigeon shed. He doesn't use those words, but that's as far as that will be. And another letter, the President says to let you know that His Holiness received your letter of the whatever, enclosed with the drawing that you did of the library some days ago. He says that the rondelles shown therein as lights can be looked upon as very beautiful, but does not know whether the dust that will fall on them will not be stronger than the light that they will be able to transmit, and whether the walls will bear the weight, or whether the structure will be damaged if the walls are heightened too broad to make windows as you propose, since part of the roof is already in position and must be now taken down and the beams removed. So Michelangelo has sent back a letter after this one, and he said, the walls are too thin. I can't go up any higher. I'd have to go up 2 more broadchop to get in clerestory windows. We can't do that. It's too dangerous. And this is the Pope's response. And what's important is window over the roof. Hipped roof. He's talking about a roof, not a ceiling. Roof, tetto, okay? And it's a hipped roof. There's your window over the roof. And then he's referring to rondelles, glass lights in the ceiling, and he uses actually the word occhi, which is kind of an abbreviation for oculus, plural. rondelles is obviously something round. He's talking about the light coming from above. And so if you put the reflected ceiling plan together with the letters, you end up with that. That's a worm's eye, isometric, sectional drawing of 1/4 of the space. I don't know if you all can read that. You're all architecture students. Some people have a tough time with that. Okay, so there's that drawing again. There's the Pantheon. There's the scheme. There's that drawing. There's what was built. And here's what happened. Michelangelo acquiesced, scrapped the skylight idea, raised the walls and included those clerestory windows to bring in light over the roofs of the buildings next door. And there's the ceiling as it was in the skylight version, one continuous plane. There's the entablature of his Pantheon scheme. Again, pilaster, column, column, pilaster, sculpture niche, pilaster, column, column, pilaster, sculpture niche. And this would not have produced very nice proportions if it simply got transferred over to here. This level would be too tall. Now again, some people argue that Michelangelo didn't think about numbers. BS. Yes, he did. You saw all of those little counting things that he was doing on the side. He was very interested in numbers and proportions. So anybody who says, it's his line of propaganda when he says to his biographers, all of my judgments are by the eye, I don't need numbers. You know, that's propaganda that we've been buying all this time. It's not true. So he pops the ceiling up, raises the height of the entablature, and something's got to give. He ends up with nice proportions, a perfect cube with the clerestory above. There's the numbers. 2 to 3 in proportion. And he reduces the pilasters. The pilasters are actually still there. The pilasters have disappeared. Right? Full pilasters, paired columns. Paired columns, where are the pilasters? Why did they go away? Because he increased the height of the columns. And he couldn't increase this dimension, so something had to give. And what gave were the pilasters. But what's interesting is that the pilasters are actually still there. The way he's dealt with this problem is he's brought what is normally the recessed wall plane forward of the Pietra Serena frame. Normally you think of a frame and you think of infill, like curtain wall. Look at what he's doing. That's a frame and that's infill. Here, the infill is protruding out from the frame. Now, that is just a complete sort of tectonic contradiction in terms, but that's what Michelangelo was famous for. He liked to play these sorts of games. Some people have said those are columns in a sculpture niche. Well, actually, no, they're not. They're not columns in a sculpture niche. Those are columns in an extremely squished exedra borrowed from the Pantheon. And the exedra, or rectangular recess, is only big enough to hold the 2 columns. And the pilasters, which are now facing sideways. They're facing this way because the stucco has been brought forward. And I like to think, the Pietra Serena looks so brittle and hard, and the stucco has got this dapple effect. It's deeply textured. It reminds me of feta cheese. It almost looks as though he's got this baking pan made out of pietraforte. And he's baking feta cheese or dough, and the dough is sort of spilling out of the form. That's the effect because of the stucco coming forward. So, one thing that I think is quite extraordinary when I was there is that when you walk up the staircase, you become aware that forms underneath your feet are repeated in the ceiling over your head. Which is pretty interesting because these 2 spaces could not be more different in terms of their form, spatial form. As soon as he realizes that he has to run with the taller ceiling, he runs with it. He attenuates his forms vertically. He's got this very strangely proportioned room, 2 to 3 in proportion, 3 being the height. Think of Palladio and other classical architects. Usually the height of a room is either the width of the room flipped vertically or a median between the length of the room added to the width divided by 2, the median. Here, this is kind of unusual for the Renaissance. It's not so unusual to us today, but you have to think about this in its context. So, the reading room, unlike the vestibule, the reading room has got this incredible degree of calm to it. One walks into that room, and this has happened countless times with students. As soon as you walk through that threshold, which is virtually an independent space right there, as soon as you walk through that threshold, suddenly you realize those darkness. There's just something about this room that kind of has a Zen quality. It's a library, after all. But the sheer beauty of it and the calmness of it could not be in greater contradiction with the sculptural eccentricities and the dynamics of the vestibule. And there have been many readings of this. Some people have said, well, since this building doesn't really have a facade per se, Michelangelo's facade is actually wrapped around an interior space. So I would suggest that you could think of this as taking the San Lorenzo facade that was never built and folding it around an interior space, because they've got a lot in common. It's also been suggested that this represents the secular world and this represents a higher plane of existence. And that what you do in a library, you read books. And so by reading books, you attain a higher level of knowledge, intellect. You're literally occupying a higher plane of existence. And so by walking up the staircase, you are actually climbing, metaphorically, from one plane of intellectual existence to another. And the reason why the staircase has got these ovular forms is not just simply to reflect the forms that are in the ceiling in the next room to create a link between them, but that these, in the words of Charles de Tolnay, it's almost as if lava is flowing out of the reading room and piling up on the vestibule floor. Now, the staircase wasn't actually finished before 1555 or so, long after Michelangelo had moved to Rome. And the very last thing, or what happened was, he left for Rome with bits and pieces of the stair basically lying around in the vestibule. And Cosimo I, the Grand Duke of Florence, told Giorgio Vasari to go in and put it, an architect named Ammannati to put it together. And they tried a few times, and it was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, and Mike didn't leave any drawings. So Vasari, or this poor guy named Tribolo, went down to Rome to ask Michelangelo in person what he had intended to do. And, and he showed Michelangelo what he had built. And I don't know if you ever noticed this, but if you go into the library and you look there or there are these very strange stars on the wall that make no sense whatsoever. They're clearly the stars of risers and treads. So this poor guy Tribolo goes to Rome, and he shows Michelangelo what he's done with Michelangelo's puzzle pieces. And Michelangelo is so horrified by how he's misinterpreted what he's looking at that Michelangelo claims senility and he's forgotten what his design was. So Tribolo goes back to Florence, has a heart attack, and dies. And so Giorgio Vasari goes down to Rome to ask him. And Giorgio Vasari is the biggest sycophant in the history of architecture and art history. Great architect, terrible painter, but most important because he wrote biographies of the greatest artists. And he was like, oh, divine Michelangelo, in all of your wisdom, what was your design for the staircase? And suddenly Michelangelo remembered. And he said, tell you what, Giorgio, I'll build a model and I'll FedEx it to Rome. You'll get it next week. So Michelangelo sculpts a model out of clay, and he sends it to Florence, and that's what Giorgio Vasari and Ammannati use to put together the staircase. This room is remarkable on many levels. It's calm, it's quiet. The furniture was designed by Michelangelo, the ceiling's designed by Michelangelo, the floor probably designed by Michelangelo, and it's all one integrated system. Because you can follow the architectural memory all the way around, top of the desk, down to the floor. Ceiling pattern is reflected in the terracotta floor. And so what you end up with is a kind of tectonic cage. Now if you think about Florentine architecture at this time, it's almost all exclusively an architecture of wall, load-bearing walls. So what's going on here? This is basically a post and lintel construction with trusses up above. This is quite revolutionary for its day. Trusses up above, pilasters on the walls. The pilasters are load-bearing. The desks are designed as an integral part of the space. And what's in between is basically curtain wall. It's only this thick, right there. 1 brick thick. For light. It had to be lightweight in order for the walls below to sustain the load. He could get away with a little bit more weight in the vestibule because it's going down 1 more floor. And he also buttressed it from the outside with on the back side that you can't see. So amazing contradiction of spaces. The vestibules, again, are almost like small spaces, and they project so far out in both directions that it's almost like a Venturi effect. It's almost like you're walking up the stairs, you're laboring against the flow of the tide, and as soon as you get to the vestibule, you're kind of shot forward on that axis. And down at the far end is exactly the same portone, which sadly now leads to nothing, a rather boring stucco triangular room. There's Mike's drawing for the desks, the beautiful, beautiful desks, and there's the house of the Martelli family, and here's what Michelangelo intended to build at the back. So he's got this, he simply takes the axis of the reading room, extends it further, draws in the angle of that house. He even labels it right there, the Casa Martelli, in his next drawing. And here's the house of Martelli, and he mirrors that angle on this side and creates what would have been, had it been built, one of the most unique spaces in the history of Western world architecture. An equilateral triangular room with the corners truncated. Now what's really cool is that not only do you have that oculus diagram, but over here he has actually said all the light comes from above because you can't find it elsewhere. Now, again, that's more support in Michelangelo's own words that the oculus was in fact intended. And it might be that down at that end he couldn't figure out or didn't get the opportunity to figure out how to light this without the oculus. And so they just gave up on the whole thing. The vault reduces to a randal above, and all the light is received from the vault because it cannot be drawn from anywhere else. In Michelangelo's own words. So it would have been one of the very first skylights, perhaps, in the history of the Western world. And that's it.